As Israel invades Lebanon, Iran launches hundreds of missiles on Israel. How dangerous is this moment for the world? Good evening. Welcome to Newsnight. Tonight, are we on the cusp of a full-blown regional war in the Middle East? Iran has launched a missile attack on Israel this evening, which is now over. Earlier today, Israeli troops invaded Lebanon. Also, in what's being described as a terrorist attack, at least 6 people have been killed in Tel Aviv by 2 gunmen. Just before we came on air, I spoke to the Shadow Security Minister and Conservative leadership candidate, Tom Tugendhat.
Well, this is an incredibly dangerous moment. This is a moment when the vicious Iranian regime is targeting not just Jews, Muslims and Christians in Israel, but is putting ballistic missiles over Jordan, over Iraq and threatening many, many people en route. This is a moment when we need the British government to be absolutely firm and clear, standing with our allies in the region, in Jordan, in Israel, and standing alongside democracies. We need to be defending our friends and standing up against our enemies.
What could happen next? Because Israel's political leaders have said they will respond. What do you think Israel should do so this doesn't escalate even further?
Well, Israel has many different options, and I'm not going to be advising them on their military actions. They have their own considerations. What I will be advising is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He should be immediately summoning Cobra and making sure that we're providing every assistance, not just to Israel and Jordan and to other allies in the region, but making sure that we're ready to support British citizens in the region, those who need assistance in leaving and those who may need assistance while they remain in place. We need to be standing with our allies, and that is exactly why this is no time for the weak leadership that we're seeing out of the Labour Party. What we actually need to see is the proper investment in defence that I've long called for, and real leadership, because the UK has a clear and important role in supporting global peace. And what instead we're seeing is silence from our government.
Well, it's not silence, is it? It feels like you're now making a political point. The British Prime Minister has spoken to Israel's Prime Minister today. He's spoken to the King of Jordan. He's made it clear that Israel has a right to defend itself. He's also called for a ceasefire. Is that what you're calling for?
No, what I'm calling for is for the right of the Israeli government to protect its people, for the right of the Jordanian government to protect its people, and for Iran to immediately stop threatening countries in the region. They've already murdered, quite literally, hundreds of thousands of people in Syria and tens and possibly even hundreds of thousands of people in Lebanon using proxy groups like Lebanese Hezbollah. The Iranian government has, over 40 years, murdered, quite literally, millions of Muslims around the Middle East. This is a vicious, despotic regime, and it is a known evil regime. We should be making sure that we're protecting ourselves and our allies against it.
How does this end, then?
It's very difficult to say. What we need to be making sure is that we're protecting our friends in the region. Countries like Bahrain and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates have often been threatened by Iran in different ways. Kuwait has been threatened as well. We need to be making sure that we're standing with them.
I want to ask you about something that's happened on the campaign trail in terms of the Tory leadership contest. And it's a video that Robert Jenrick, one of the contenders, put out, one of his campaign videos. Just have a look.
Our special forces are killing rather than capturing terrorists because our lawyers tell us that if they're caught, the European court will set them free.
What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, it's factually wrong. It simply isn't true. That would be a breach of the law of armed conflict, and it would be a violation of the values and standards of the British Armed Forces. I've spoken to a few former directors of special forces today, friends of mine who have commanded operations, are the ones that are referred to there. It's just not true, and it would be wrong to do so.
Special forces are not killing rather than capturing terrorists.
That is simply not true. It is not true that special forces are doing that. It is also not true that the ECHR prevents us conducting kinetic strikes, as they're called, often military operations against military targets. It just isn't true. And what's particularly upsetting is that video is using a piece of footage of some of the people I served with, one of whom there died shortly after that film was taken in an accident, and is not able to defend himself from the accusation that is effectively being levelled against him.
So that is actually footage
Yes.
of somebody you knew?
Yes, that's footage of a soldier in northern Afghanistan in around 2002.
How do you feel about that then?
Well, I do not think that we should be using footage of our Special Forces soldiers in operations.
Should Robert Jenrick remove that footage?
I would not put that video out. In fact, I'd put it down.
And should he clarify what he meant?
I'm afraid I'm not sure clarification is the problem. It's a complete and fundamental misunderstanding of what it is to be a military commander on operations and what the ECHR has an effect on in time of war. I published 2 papers on this in 2013 and 2015 for Policy Exchange, the first called The Fog of Law, the second Clearing the Fog of Law, on the effect that the ECHR has on the battlefield and why I believe that we need to opt out of certain elements of it, reform others, and if necessary be prepared to make other decisions. But this is simply factually incorrect.
So he needs to withdraw his remarks and apologise?
Well, I think this video is simply wrong.
Right. You sound quietly furious.
How would you feel if a friend of yours who died a few years after the film was taken was being included in an accusation that would be, were he to be responsible for it, which, let me be just absolutely clear, he would not and did not do, in an accusation that would be against the values and standards of the armed forces?
Thank you very much for talking to Newsnight. Thank you. Tom Tugendhat, and we will talk more later on in the programme about that Jenrick campaign video. Amongst our guests tonight, Times columnist and Conservative peer Danny Finkelstein. Also Dr Afshin Shahi, Senior Lecturer in Middle East Politics at Keele University, and Jasmine El Gamal, a former Middle East advisor at the US Department of Defence. And obviously Nick is here. We'll talk to Nick a little bit later. Welcome all of you. Dr Shahi, if I could begin with you about the Iran missile attack. Is this over now? Have they sent their message?
I think actually this is more than a message. Effectively, this is a declaration of a war that has the potential to change the security landscape of the region beyond recognition. And what is so puzzling at this stage is that why the Islamic Republic has took the risk for a major escalation. You know, over the last 3 or 4 decades, what we have seen is effectively a Cold War, a lot of friction going on between Iran and Israel. But one of the main reasons, it's not the only reason, but one of the main reasons that these frictions did not turn into a major escalation was because Iran was effectively using Hezbollah as a deterrence strategy. And what we have seen over the last week or so, that in the matter of 7 days, effectively the command structure and the communication infrastructure of Hezbollah crumbled, and that leaves Iran in a very, very, very vulnerable position. Until a few hours ago, it seemed that a lot of people thought that Iran probably is not going to retaliate, because a retaliation effectively gives Netanyahu a license to kind of increase pressure on Iran and potentially target sensitive military and nuclear sites in Iran. And if obviously a nuclear site being kind of targeted by Israel at this stage, of course that is going to create an existential crisis for the Islamic Republic. And of course you have to remember, this is a regime that is facing with a crisis of legitimacy at home, and this kind of new existential crisis is going to create a very, very unpredictable situation and conditions in the region.
Let me bring in Jasmine El Gamal. The US have said, Jasmine, that there will be severe consequences. What will be going on? Give us some insight into what kind of conversations will be going on in the Biden administration tonight.
Right. Well, of course, the major theme in the conversations is how to de-escalate the situation and make sure that this war, which is ongoing, doesn't escalate even further and draw in the U.S. even further. Now, as you know, the U.S. has assets in the region, and it has stated very publicly, unequivocally, that they would be there, and they are there for the defense of Israel in case that is needed. Now, the question is exactly how does that de-escalation happen and what are the steps that are needed to be put in place right now for that to happen. We've seen over the last few months the U.S. At least publicly stating that they are in favor of a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, that they have been working tirelessly towards a ceasefire. But what we've been seeing in the last several weeks, maybe a couple of months, is almost a giving up on that prospect, that the U.S. administration no longer believes that a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, regardless of what they say in public, is on the horizon. And so they have sort of quietly agreed with the Israelis that a shift by the Israelis from the war or the focus on Hamas to a focus on their northern front with Hezbollah is the right way to go. And you've seen U.S. officials saying that they believe, at least in private, and this was reported to Politico on the condition of anonymity by 4 U.S. officials, that they see this as an opportunity in Lebanon to turn the tide in the Middle East and perhaps create a new reality. And Victoria, I know that you, as well as everyone on this panel, remember that the last time U.S. officials and others thought that that a new tide could be turned in the Middle East was Condoleezza Rice saying new birth pangs of the Middle East during the Iraq War, and we all know how that ended up. And so it's an incredibly dangerous time right now, especially for people who are advocating for more military confrontations as a way to try to address issues that are at their heart, political and diplomatic issues.
Okay. Lord Finkelstein, I suppose where this goes next depends on how Israel responds. Back in April, there was a symbolic attack, a symbolic response, it was described as. Depends what they do next.
It does. Look, I'm not a military expert. Sure. You obviously heard from diplomatic and military experts who know far more than I. But what I do understand is a little bit of the psychology of the Jews who live in Israel and actually the Jews who support Israel's right to exist here. Israel's a refuge for Jews. Half the Jews in the world live in Israel, and it's simply not possible as a matter of policy, politically, or in terms of the existence of the Jewish people, to allow Israel to be insecure. So it has to respond in the way that it does. And sometimes that isn't the most diplomatically, sort of easy route. And also, as we can see, lots of people die in these instances. So they're appalling to contemplate. Yeah. But it's hard, at least for me, to see what the alternative is until Hezbollah, the Iranian government, Hamas as well, understand and accept Israel's right to exist and right to exist within secure borders.
And the Defence Secretary has just released a statement, Nick.
That's right, Vic. So in the last few minutes, we have heard from John Healey, the Defence Secretary, saying that UK forces have this evening played their part in attempts to prevent further escalation in the Middle East. This suggests that what the UK has done is probably pretty similar to what the UK did back in April, the last time Iran launched ballistic missile attacks on Israel. So what happened then was that US, French and UK forces were involved in either helping to shoot down those missiles or help to provide reconnaissance and intelligence. And John Healey talking about how he wants to thank all British personnel involved in the operation for their courage and professionalism. And then he says, the UK stands fully behind Israel's right to defend its country and its people against threats.
Dr. Shahi, when Israel responds, what might Iran do then?
Depends on the nature of retaliation, because at the moment there are a lot of speculations. Is Netanyahu going to use this opportunity to target Iranian military and nuclear sites? If that is going to be the case, then we can imagine that is easily going to escalate to a major, multifaceted and multidimensional crisis in the region. If Israel decides to target these sites, what I can imagine that Iran is going to mobilize its forces in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and of course their retaliation is going to kind of create the existing dynamic even more complex and unpredictable. So I assume that given the very weak defense infrastructure that Iran has, they're very much hoping that Israel is going to be persuaded by the international community, primarily the United States, to exercise restraint or only limit itself to a symbolic gesture, very much like what they did last April after the Iranian attack.
Jasmine El-Gamal, finally and briefly, is there any hope for diplomacy? It has failed certainly in the last 3 weeks, but longer than that. Is there any hope?
I'm glad you asked that question and ended on that note, because there absolutely is hope for diplomacy, Victoria, but there has to be the political will to do it. Now, I think we can all agree on the right of Israelis to live in peace. I don't hear a lot of people on these programs talking about the right of Middle Eastern people to also live in peace. They're often referred to as human shields, very dehumanizing terms. But at the end of the day, all of the people in the region deserve to live in peace. And that's why diplomacy has to be given a chance. Now, there is a diplomatic offer on the table. It is the basis of the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002. The Jordanian Foreign Minister, Ayman Safadi, just a few days ago, said at the UN in New York that the Arab and Muslim states are willing today, right now, to work and guarantee Israel's security and safety in the region in the context of the end to the occupation and a two-state solution. That is the political horizon. But again, Victoria, there needs to be a political will to do it and an understanding on the part of Israel's friends that what is happening right now, what has happened in the last year and what is going to happen when Israel responds to this, is not making anyone in the Middle East safer, let alone Israelis. And of course, the hundreds of thousands of Arabs and Muslims in the region who have been affected by this as well. So diplomacy is the only way to make every actor in the region safer.
Thank you very much, Jasmine El-Gamal. Afshin Shahi, thank you. Thank you. Right, let's talk about what's happened here at the Tory party conference today, where the heat has been on one of the contenders, Robert Jenrick, over a campaign video. Let's take another look at what Tom Tugendhat told us earlier.
And what's particularly upsetting is that video is using a piece of footage of some of the people I served with, one of whom there died shortly after that film was taken in an accident, and is not able to defend himself from the accusation that is effectively being levelled against him.
So that is actually footage of somebody you knew?
Yes, that's footage of a soldier in northern Afghanistan in around 2002.
How do you feel about that then?
Well, I do not think that we should be using footage of our Special Forces soldiers in operations.
Tom Tugendhat. Welcome to the political editor of The Guardian. Pippa Crerar is with us as well. Hello to you. Tom Tugendhat revealing that tonight, Pippa Crerar, what impact is that going to have?
Well, I think in this very small environment that we're in here at Conservative Party conference, it will be the first example of what has been so far a very slick campaign from Robert Jenrick. He's in the lead amongst Conservative MPs. He's certainly the one with the momentum and the one candidate out of the four that most people assume will automatically make it to the last two when it gets beyond the MPs' round of voting. And this is really the first example that we've had of his campaign not quite going to plan. The impact, obviously, that this video has had on Tom Tugendhat in particular, because obviously he has his own forces background, and a friend of his, as he revealed to you tonight, was in that video. I think it will definitely cause ripples. It will be the first sign that maybe the very slick and professional campaign that Robert Jenrick has run so far is perhaps not quite as successful as it might otherwise have been.
So what is interesting is that video is based, Robert Jenrick says, on some remarks that the former Defence Secretary, Sir Ben Wallace, gave to the Daily Telegraph, where he said last year that human rights laws mean that the UK is forced into taking lethal action rather than actually raiding and detaining terror suspects. And the reason for that, Ben Wallace says, is that if terror suspects were to surrender, you can't render them, you can't take them to another country. Now, the point is that the examples Ben Wallace gave of lethal actions were, he described drone strikes and what he called kinetic airstrikes. The example that Robert Jenrick used were special forces soldiers on the ground.
Yeah.
That is not what Ben Wallace was talking about here. And as I understand it, the view amongst the special forces is they are, as it would put to me, incandescent about this. And these people are very careful. They don't talk about this stuff. But I spoke to one source from that world, and they said that they thought that Robert Jenrick was a bleep, and they hope this will sink his campaign.
Could it?
Well, it's certainly not very helpful to his campaign. I don't think it'll sink it by itself. There's a question of whether it ought to. I mean, I think on such a hot topic involving, such sort of emotive and tricky thing, to put out something that was quite as sloppy as that, both legally and politically, well, it was, the very least it was a political error. But beyond that, I think it's a very odd thing for someone who wants to be the leader of a political party and wants to be Prime Minister to do. So, and apart from anything else, it's obviously straying into an area where Tom Tugendhat enjoys the advantage of expertise. So you're leading with your chin, really, politically.
So if either of you were advising the Robert Jenrick campaign, what would you tell him to do now? I mean, Tom Tugendhat has said, pull it down.
Well, I'm afraid that I actually don't think apologies and withdrawing work very well in politics. From a moral point of view, and I certainly agree with Tom Tugendhat, so Tom's completely correct to press him to do it, and I think it would be the right thing to do. Whether it would be politically effective, though, I'm not so sure.
And also because, ultimately it's a dividing line. This video was produced because he's the one candidate out of the four that supports withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights. The other three have all got variations on the theme of reform. If circumstances meant that we had to, we might consider it at some point in the future. But he's been pretty unequivocal about it. So it was using this as a political ploy, really, to sort of to reinforce that dividing line. Possibly, cynically, politically, actually it does that even more because it's attracting to attention to his difference of opinion.
Close to in the campaign, and they said, look, it cuts through to the members.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's very unfortunate because I'd love to be able to say, politically the most effective thing to do is the thing that I think is the right thing to do. But actually, I'm not so clear about that. I think if Robert Jenrick wants to press home his point on the ECHR, which I happen to disagree with for pretty much precisely the reasons we're getting into now, I think the accusations against it are often legally quite sloppy. Well, I wouldn't do that. I would probably press on with it, I'm afraid.
It's interesting. Robert Jenrick, dramatically showing his opposition to the ECHR. Kemi Badenoch the other day raising questions about the level of maternity pay. Perhaps things, as you were saying, that they may want to do when you get to the membership stage, when it's just the membership. Well, we've got 2 rounds of ballots next week amongst MPs, and there are a lot of MPs thinking,
Yes. By the way, we were supposed to have an interview with Robert Jenrick, a pre-recorded interview, but for some reason that didn't happen. Tomorrow, all 4 candidates make a 20-minute speech to the activists and members here in Birmingham. It's been described by some as the Tories' version of the Hunger Games. James Cleverly is going to promise in his speech tomorrow to increase defence spending to 3% of GDP and abolish stamp duty. Plus, he's going to call on the Conservatives to stop being what he calls the grumpy party. I asked him first about those Mr Jenrick's comments that have dominated today at the conference. Hello, Mr Cleverly, how are you?
Hi, Victoria.
Hi, right, I'm going to start with that last subject, if I may. As ex-military, have you ever seen any evidence, and particularly when you're in the Foreign Office as well, of British forces killing people abroad?
Look, thank you. Thank you. Look, so this is a very, very, very serious issue. If anyone believes that they know of breaches of law of armed conflict or breaches of the rules of engagement, they should make that position clear. And look, I'm not comfortable.
Do you think it happens?
Well, I've seen no evidence of that. I don't pretend to be any, massively experienced operational soldier. My career was in the reserve forces, but we should all take this incredibly seriously. And if there is specific information to justify that line, that claim, then we need to see it.
He needs to see it. He needs to say it.
Well, he said something. He needs to explain it, justify it, or retract it.
In your speech tomorrow, you're going to talk about promising to raise defence spending to 3% and abolish stamp duty. How are you going to pay for that? It's about 29 billion a year, according to the IFS.
So one of the things that we've got to do differently, we've got to think very differently. When governments take money from people through taxation, it is the job of the government to justify why it's taking money off of people, rather than people expect the individuals to justify why they keep it. Thank you, mate. Thank you. Now, the point is, stamp duty will free up liquidity in the housing market, get property market moving, help people downsize, and also help first-time buyers.
But it leaves a hole in the Treasury of 29 billion
so look,
for defence spending and abolishing stamp duty.
So if we want to be a low-tax country, a lower tax country, and we should be, we need to start making decisions about bringing down taxes. Now, this is a tax which stifles the housing market, which young people tell me over and over and over again is not working for them.
I get that, but where are you going to make up the money elsewhere?
We are going to spend less as a government. We're going to spend better.
Okay.
We're going to spend on what we need to spend, not on everything.
So equivalent amount of cuts, is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is, if we want to be a low-tax economy, a lower-tax economy, to compete on the international stage, we should start finding ways of cutting tax. And cutting taxes which stimulate market activity are good taxes.
I'm on your team now.
Oh, Vicky, thank you.
Bloody awesome.
Thank you, mate. Thank you.
Anything I
Thank
can
you.
do that took my breath away.
Imagine.
And I
Is this staged or is this genuine?
No, I came here completely that 3 of the candidates I was prepared to back. I wanted to listen to them all. This man took my breath away. I have known them for peace inside out. That's the best I've ever seen you, James.
Why, Vicky? Why? Thank you.
Because that's why I'm a Conservative.
In your speech, you're also going to say you've had enough of being the grumpy party. What does that mean? What have you been grumpy about?
So we have got to demonstrate to the world and to the country we seek to serve that we are optimistic, energetic, positive, forward-thinking, not harking to a time gone by, but looking to a better future. If we do that, I think we will attract voters of every age, from every geography, and get back into the habit of winning again.
But don't you think voters are grumpy with you because of the state, the NHS, can't get a GP appointment, can't get an NHS dentist, waiting for hours and hours in A&E? They're grumpy with you because that's how you left the country?
Well, look, I recognise that we were kicked out of government for a reason, so we need to repair that. But part of the offer to the British people is that we are a positive party, a positive government, and one that listens to their concerns, but doesn't just thank you, mate. But doesn't just leave it there, that having listened to their concerns, we actually do something about fixing them. That's the positivity.
Fixing the stuff that you broke, essentially? Is that fair?
No.
Why not?
Because we have had the most unique set of challenges. We have had COVID, which has hit our economy and our health service incredibly hard. But the point is, when people tell you that they are hurting, when they tell you that they are frustrated, when they tell you that they are angry, we should recognise that, listen to that, and actually what we should do is not just reflect that back to them, but actually do something about it. And I'm determined to do something about it.
You said you would still accept freebies if you became leader of the opposition. Why?
Because my criticism of Starmer is not that he accepted gifts. My criticism of Starmer is the grotesque hypocrisy of doing so whilst criticising us for doing so.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Cleverly.
Victoria, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Scott Lewis.
So he's actually fleshing out the kind of things he might promise voters, Pippa Crewe.
It's really odd, actually, because this conference is about the inner workings of the Conservative Party, the direction that members and the MPs want the party to go in. And yet we're hearing some quite specific policy pledges from James Cleverly. And it actually reflects a sort of a broader sentiment that I've picked up around the conference, which is one of denial. It's almost like the Conservative Party isn't yet through the first stage of grief after their devastating election loss. And that even though they know that they've lost, they haven't quite got their heads around it and what that means. And the reality is, of opposition, that to get attention, you need to shout quite loud. And people aren't particularly interested, particularly at this point after an election, in the specifics of your policy pledges. There was a poll earlier today which suggested that 2/3 of people don't care who the next Conservative leader is. Yeah. They've got a lot of winning back even the right to be heard in the public before you even get on to things like tax cuts and defence spending.
Do you agree?
I do agree, and I think there's a problem strategically with the position that James Cleverly is laying out, which is, it's all right to say you want tax cuts, but you're immediately committing yourself to going into a future general election, which is years away, promising to reduce public spending, and that it will be very difficult to do. Nevertheless, I understand what his pitch is. He's trying to pitch himself as a sort of more genial, more likeable, somewhat more moderate in demeanour, without necessarily moving away from the position of the other candidates. I think that's actually quite attractive. And the odd thing about Cleverly's candidacy, he could easily finish fourth, but he really could win. He's liked a lot. And if he got into second position, I think he could possibly win the whole contest.
I mean, it's interesting on that. I mean, you and I were both in the hall for James Cleverly. I mean, he had a very, very good reception. There were some people standing up at the end. There were jokes. And with James Cleverly, you do feel it's a bit like sort of the greatest hits tour, which was, I was a really good foreign secretary, I was a really good home secretary, I was a really good party chairman. It's sort of like the greatest hits, look what I've done. But when you hear Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch speak, they say this was a terrible, dreadful general election result. And by the way, here's some radical surgery for the country, which obviously then becomes debatable.
Yes. Let's hear a little bit more of something that Kemi Badenoch said today. Yesterday, she actually told me, I've never had a gaffe. Was this one today at a Spectator Fringe event at the Conservative conference? Have a listen.
There's about 5 to 10% of them who are very, very bad, should be in prison bad. Leaking official secrets, undermining their ministers, telling, agitating. I had some of it in my department, usually union-led. But most of them actually want to do a good job.
Yeah, what I should have made clear before we went to that clip is that she's talking about 5 to 10% of civil servants are really, really bad and should be in prison. Now, we heard the tone. Was it a joke?
Probably, but it reflects, she actually went on at some length about how she feels about civil servants, and it reflects what a lot of Conservative MPs know and fear about Kemi Badenoch's temperament, and which actually she also said at that Spectator event about always being up for a fight. She is going to be somebody, if she becomes a Conservative leader, that will have a very belligerent and aggressive approach. That is not necessarily the one which will go down well with the public, because they already see the Conservative Party as being caught up in infighting and internal battles.
So I don't think these are gaffes. I think it's a deliberate strategy. I think she believes that her best chance of becoming leader is not the genial style of James Cleverly, but it is, as you said, more combative, and it is to have a sort of star quality and have cut through, and therefore be able to take on people like Nigel Farage by being an opposition leader who is miles behind, that captures attention. That's what she's trying to do. I have my questions over it, but, and you've explained why. I just think being in a position of saying that 5 to 10% of civil servants deserve to be in jail, I just think she's wrong.
Okay. In jail for leaking, because, of course, no current members of the Shadow Cabinet have ever leaked, and indeed no members of the former Cabinet, of course, were guilty of leaking. Of course they weren't.
We're out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us. And thanks for your company. That is it. We're back tomorrow. See you then.